Bonjour, bonjour. It is the Jour de la Bastille. It is July 14th, 2024. And I wanted to share with you the reason why I am doing the reading on July 23rd with Jerome Harris, doing a recitation of Kerouac, of Jacques Kerouac, who was French Canadian, by extraction, who ended up living in Lowell, Massachusetts, with his family, and of course is most famous for On the Road. On July 23rd, there's a 2-year anniversary celebration of the dopest bookstore in Brooklyn. The bookstore is called Leaves Bookstore, and it's located at 140 Nassau Avenue. If you look over in my community section, I've put up a little kind of digital flyer for this event, which is free, and it's going to be from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. on a Tuesday. So I just felt really moved to read a little bit, because in art, hopefully, if we're lucky enough to know the people that came before us, there is a lineage. And I was lucky enough to meet a good friend of Jack Kerouac's, a Mr. David Amram. David Amram, who is a composer, is an author, is a performer, who is now 93 years young, and who is, in my opinion, and the opinion of many, an American treasure. Just full of vitality, and has composed so many things, symphonies and concertos. His music is performed regularly with the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra. He's worked closely with James Galway, but also just a real groovy cat. So the first time I met David was through the Howl Festival. Now, the Howl Festival was named after beat poet Allen Ginsberg's poem, Howl, because back around 2003, 2002, 2003, there was a lot of corporate encroachment on the East Village, which of course alarmed us, and especially a gentleman named Phil Hartman, who owned a Pioneer Theater, an independent screening theater, and Two Boots Pizza, decided to spearhead and push back against this kind of corporate takeover and let the artist's presence be known. And it was a festival that ran for a few years before that came to an end for other different reasons. Phil had to take care of, some business that he needed to attend to. But it was a festival that ran for 7 days, 7 nights, was in 250 different venues in the East Village, and had something like 1,500 performances in this very small amount of time. Now, as it turned out, I was helping this friend of mine, this guy named Mike McHugh, who was a booker at this venue called the C Note, which was on Avenue C and 10th Street. And so because of this, and trying to scheduling, programming that corresponded with this mood of the Howl Festival, and because there were 7 slots, 7 nights, because the C Note was really always open for business and for the arts, I collaborated with Mike to book acts and to find acts to be in that. As it turns out, one of the people, her name is Casey Sear Gash, helped us curate this fabulous evening, or rather she curated this fabulous evening based on the posthumous release of one of Jack's books called Old Angel Midnight. So because of Casey, who was friends with David Amram, that's how I met David in person. Actually, there's a story behind a story here. I had a friend of mine at the time. His name was John Kruth, and John Kruth was a musician. He played mandolin. He did a lot of recordings, independently, and he also used to write for different jazz magazines like Wax Poetics. Now, for some reason, I think John also knew David. So one day, John says to me, "Oh, well, can you call up David Amram? I don't have time to call him. Can you call him for me and tell him such and such and blah?" So, of course, being on the production team, I said sure. But I was a little intimidated, I must say, because David Amram, aside from being a good friend of Jack Kerouac's, which I didn't know that then, has an incredible list of accomplishments to his name, like doing the score for Splendor in the Grass with Elia Kazan, the original score for The Manchurian Candidate, being a guest conductor with Leonard Bernstein, composing the music for the New York Shakespeare Festival established by Joe Papp in 1965 in Central Park. It just goes on and on and on and on. So I was a little intimidated about calling David, but I called David nonetheless. And I found on the other end of this phone a man so vibrant and so alive. And actually, as I was talking to him on a cell phone on his way to the FedEx office in Pittsburgh, where he was, in effect, getting ready to either go to a rehearsal or do a performance with James Galway, who was the conductor of the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra. So that was my initial contact with David Amram. My second contact with David Amram, and I believe was my first time in person, was when Casey Sirgash managed to gather us all together for a recitation again of Old Angel Midnight at the Seed Note during the Howl Festival. And David Amram's band consisted of him on keyboards, flugelhorn, three-penny whistle, the dudek, various percussion instruments. Amazing. He was like 74 at the time. Renee Hart, who was on acoustic bass, and also, I believe, Kevin Twigg was on drums. The evening was incredible, right? And one of the things that David mentioned about his friend Jack was how he and Jack, or Jack and he, were basically doing kind of the first spoken word performances in the East Village in this little place called the Bratta Gallery. The Bratta Gallery. There used to be a lot of galleries. I believe it was on 9th Street. I believe. I could be wrong about that. But there used to be a lot of galleries on 9th Street in the East Village. So this is where Jack and David did the first kind of spoken word thing. Later on, because of this wonderful performance that I got to be a part of, reading Old Angel Midnight, somehow or another, I was invited to read with David Amram during the anniversary of Cornelia Street's Cafe. I believe it was, I'm trying to remember what year it was. It was about, I think it was about 2012 or 2014, and it was all out on the sidewalk. And Cornelia Street's kind of the street that kind of winds around. It's kind of almost like a secret street, if you were, in the West Village. And of course, David and his band was going to play. So it was Jim Campolongo on guitar, his son Adam Amram on congas. I believe Kevin Twigg was playing on drums. David was on the keyboards, and then there was a whole host of other players whose names I don't recall. I don't know if I was properly introduced to them because everything was kind of in full swing at that point. So if you look on the previous video that I posted a few days ago, you're going to see my live performance that was filmed by Sharon Kaufman at the Cornelia Street Cafe. I'm reciting Children of the American Bop Night. So later, I got to do a performance, again, reading the same poetry piece at the New York Chamber Music Festival, which was produced by Elmira Davarova, wonderful woman, who organized this thing for a few years in a row, and the performances was basically David. It was basically a combination of David's, ensemble music. The New York Piano Quartet played, the David Amram Quartet played, and there were various guest artists as well. And there was a piece where there was poetry. So, by some magic, I was invited again up on stage to read this piece, which was a favorite of David's, Children of the American Pop Night. Of course, it would be a favorite of David's because David was a person who actually did know, like, Charles Mingus, and actually played with Charles Mingus at some point. So, yeah, David is just all into everything. Okay. So as I am preparing for the event that we're having on Tuesday, July 23rd at Leaves Bookstore in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, I am curating and I'm becoming more familiar with Jack's work, which is extraordinary. He is, of course, known most famously for On the Road, but my God, he has written so many other things. And as I was perusing some of the books that are available for purchase at Leaves Bookstore, it's a used bookstore, I came across this book. It's called Jack's Book. And Jack's Book is an oral biography of Jack Kerouac. It was put together by two gentlemen, one named Barry Gifford and another guy named Lawrence Lee. And it is a telling of who Jack was by his friends, by his lovers, by his collaborators. And I opened the book today, and who do I see in the book? But David Amram. David would say that, it's important to carry the torch forward. So I just wanted to read this little excerpt that David had to say about his good old friend Jack, and which I just think is extraordinary, the connection here. This is what David says. Jack, if you'd ride around on the subway with him or just go out on the street, would talk to everybody and be natural and real with anybody. We used to walk around New York streets for hours. One time we were hanging out with Allen Ginsberg, and there was a guy we met in the Bowery. He was a full-time wino named Buddy, the wino. Come on, we'll go up to Allen's place and we'll all read poems. I just listened. I didn't have any instruments with me, and I was glad just to be a listener for a change. So I went up and listened to Jack, Allen, and Buddy, the wino, all night long. Jack had Mexico City Blues, which was neatly typed on a big roll of shelving paper. It took the whole night. Allen would read a poem, and Buddy, who was drinking wine, would say, "Yeah, that's pretty nice. I can dig that. That's nice. That's all right." Then, when Jack would read his poems, Buddy would flip out and scream with laughter and slap his knee and do a lot of really wigged out cracking up, falling on the floor. He liked Allen's poems too, but he really identified with Jack's. And Jack read quietly while Allen was reading a poem. Oh, and Jack said real quietly while Allen was reading a poem, "These guys are where I get so much inspiration from and learn so much from. They are true poets of the streets." And the way he said it wasn't like a sociologist saying, "Now I'm descending into the lower depths to chronicle the primitive speech patterns of the proletariat dropouts." He meant it in the sense that he actually saw past all that misery and degradation and suffering with his own drinking habit himself, and he could see the soulfulness, the tragedy, and the true poetic vision some of these people really had, as if they were in touch with the great beatific light. Jack didn't mean to imply that everyone should just lie around in the Bowery and drink Sterno in order to become a better writer. That wasn't the point of what he was saying, and he never tried to encourage people to do that. He wished that he could have had a more stable life, stay more sober, and not drink as much, although he loved to drink. When he was drunk, he had a ball. Still, he knew it was killing him and it was bad, and that he was doing it because he was so shy, and because drinking killed his shyness and eased his pain. The pain and pressure, ironically, came from frustrated English major types who were outraged by his non-literary lifestyle. Of course, as we know, On the Road was like a big thing, right? That's where he really became famous. People would come up and say all these hostile things to him. After On the Road came out, I remember seeing a guy on Sheridan Square in Greenwich Village with a big Colonel Blimp type mustache. He was in his late 40s, I guess, with a super Ivy League ad agency, great looking tweed coat, those Oxford gray pants with the loafers all shined up with tassels on them, probably had $25 socks on, very distinguished, looked like the old time Esquire magazine executive, and he was saying, "Where's that F-bomb?" I'm not sure if I can say this on YouTube, but I'm going to say it. "Where's that fucking Jack Kerouac? I want to meet that bastard. He can't write." That shit ain't writing. Any junior high school student. Shit. He doesn't even use any punctuation. That fucking bastard. I want to meet that moron. Unquote. The guy was raving like a lunatic, hoping that someone in Sheridan Square could introduce him to Jack Kerouac so he could have a fantastic Ernest Hemingway 3-day literary punch-out. And the irony of it was that Jack was in fact a deeply intellectual person. He knew so much about Céline, Rimbaud, all kinds of poets, French history, music. He was into everything. He was incredibly intellectual, literate, and spiritual. And he didn't see being a literate person as acting like he possessed the secret to the literary atomic bomb, or we're going to blow everybody off the face of the earth if they get too close to you to try and find out what you knew that enabled you to get your work out to the public. Jack would definitely tell anybody that he knew about writing who would listen. Jack used to say to me that a writer should be like a shadow. Just be part of the sidewalk like a shadow. He said that one afternoon as we were strolling around shadow style on McDougal Street in December 1957, the day after our first jazz poetry reading at the Circle in the Square Theater. He would usually avoid trouble, but sometimes he'd be with people who were in a more negative groove. He got punched out, I remember, because he was with a guy who acted real obnoxious because he was with Jack, and Jack didn't want to just stand there and let the guy who was stoned out get beaten up. He had so much loyalty to this guy who was ripping him off that he wound up taking his punches where he tried to be a peacemaker. But that was mostly when he was drunk. But that was mostly when he drank, and he drank mostly when he came into New York. This is so interesting. At the Vanguard, he got real shy. It was hard for him to read there. The Vanguard's a tough place to work if you've never performed in New York. I've played there and love it, but it took me 25, 30 years to learn how to be in places like that and feel comfortable and have a ball. That's a special art. It's just like a boxer being able to enjoy working out in a gym. You have to just get used to that groove and go with it. But if you come in there and you don't know what's happening, you get claustrophobic and feel like you're down in a hole of some kind. The Vanguard has a certain kind of crazy subterranean 19th century Parisian vibe that no place else does. Jack was just freaked out by it, started drinking a lot and getting embarrassed. When we did our jazz poetry reading a month before he played at the Vanguard, Philip LaMantia, Howard Hart, and an army of friends all used to go outside and drink that Thunderbird wine during intermission and get stoned. I'd sit during intermission and play the piano in the hallway of the circle in the square while people were going out to try to talk to Jack. Then they'd all come back again and yell for Jack to read something. Half the time, he wouldn't come back for half an hour. That's when I first learned to ad-lib songs with rhymes from suggestions in the audience just to fill time. One night, the lighting designer came down and said, "What can I do for you? What kind of lighting do you want when Jack comes on? Does he want something different?" Howard Hart said, "Just do whatever you feel." So the lighting designer flipped out. That was the first time in his life he ever had what he considered to be a spontaneous lightning jam session. No more lighting cues. It was his big chance to wail. They'd be reading all these insane poems and there'd be this crazy light. This was way before psychedelic lighting or strobe lights. Not only flashing lights in airport and highway high beams in the audience faces, but all kinds of wild faces and traveling fog lights and searchlights. It was the first chance he ever had to express himself, and the things he'd do would be so crazy that we would make sounds to go along with what the lighting was like. Half the stuff was just improvised, and Jack would start scat singing. It was really amazing. It was audience attack, but always with a cosmic sense of humor. People would scream out things to him, and he'd answer in a real super down home party style. It was a definite contrast to the grim world of cocktail party quality lit. And everything was so conservative in 1957 that what we did to close out the year was really out there. David Amram's contribution to the Book of Jack, an oral biography of Jack Kerouac by Barry Gifford and Lawrence Lee. I'm so tickled by this because I consider David a friend. So I guess I'm just going to close with the fact that I will have some rare merchandise for sale at this gig, most notably these very limited copies that I have. Maybe I'll just bring a couple. The Chamber Music of David Amram, live at the New York Chamber Music Festival. And when you look down, it says Elmira Dararova, Tomoko Kanamaru, Carol Winchenk, Hishin Chao Liao, Howard Wall, and then it says Akayani. And then his daughter Adira Amram, Douglas Yeager, Face the Music Ensemble, the New York Piano Quartet, with Wendy Sutter, the David Amram Quartet with Kevin Twigg, Renee Hart, and Adam Amram. And this came out on Ehrlich Records. So, my God, this was recorded in 2012. And this was a complete surprise to me because I had no idea anything was being recorded. And so somehow or another, I found myself on a recording with David Amram. So I have a few copies of these left. Again, I'll have them at the show in case anyone is interested. But it's a beautiful record. David is an amazing person. As a matter of fact, the last time I saw him, which was at his 93rd or 94th birthday party at Theater for a New City, he gave me a copy of his David Amram live in Germany, and these are recordings that were done from 1954 to 2013. He also just published a new book. So I'm just very grateful to David. I'm very grateful to, be carrying the torch forward. Jerome Harris, I am so excited to be working with Jerome Harris. He is an extraordinary musician. And if you look in the description box of, this video on this channel, you're going to see a link to my Facebook page, and on the Facebook page, at the top of the page, is pinned the information about the event, if you want to share it, or if you're going to be in the area and want to attend. Again, it's free. It's very informal. It's going to be in Leaves Bookstore in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. And happy Bastille Day. Rest in peace, Jack. You revolutionized American literature and writing, and we're still finding out so much about you. Bye-bye.